If Sandy is correct, it usually is 99.9% of the time, if not the full 100. That we have more people on our live stream right now. But I just wanted to share something that I think is probably in other people's heads as well, which is that I believe that one of the things that makes this event so special is being able to see what our alum have done, whether it's from the the younger scholar who has just been out a few years to mid-career scholars. It's incredibly inspiring, and it just makes us all very proud. So our alum are really the heart of this program, from those who have gotten their undergrad here, master's, or their doctorate. And I know I can't ask the people online to stand up, but if you are an alum of this program, okay, even if you're still in the program, but you're still an alum, please stand up for a second, okay? All right, and I saw some other alum earlier. We had Salience here earlier, we had Chija here earlier, right? Okay, so now if you are an alum and a former advisee of Chuck Atkins, please remain standing.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to introduce you all to Dr. Jimbo Crone, who was one of Chuck's advisees in the 1980s and still lives in Michigan and came back to visit for this event today. Yeah. And we're just really excited to have you here. So with that, I will let Susan speak.
All right, hi everyone. Welcome back. I'm very excited to introduce our second speaker today. So Dr. Jackie Zhuang is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Texas Christian University, TCU. So after earning her PhD from this department in 2014, she worked as a research associate with the Community Engagement Core at MSU Superfund Center for about 3 to 4 years, and then joined TCU. So Eugene, when she was introducing our first speaker, set the bar incredibly high for me by sharing a funny story about her connection with Dr. Han and her fear of Dr. Tamburini and all these things. I unfortunately have no personal story to share because I just met Dr. Zhuang today, but I think we are connected by our research interest in health communication and persuasion. So I'm really excited to hear about her topic, which is the forgotten role of social norms in fearful events. So let's give her a warm round of applause.
I'm just going to pull out my, I think I did. I don't need a OneNote. We will show. All right, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, first of all, let me just say it's, is the OneNote? Well, first of all, let me just say thank you all so much for inviting me. It's such an honor. I have spent 10 years in this building. It's a long time. And where I met my husband and raised 2 kids. And I also owe a lifelong debt to many of you in this room, including probably my dear advisor, Dr. Mara Brestham on YouTube. So I just want to thank you all for having me. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a research question that I've been thinking about during this pandemic. My title of this talk is The Forgotten Role of Social Norms in a Pandemic. Are people more or less likely to comply with social norms when facing risk? So, this is not working.
Lindsay had trouble.
And if you didn't point it directly at it, it was working. Maybe. Maybe not.
This is our last test.
Yeah.
Turn down the switches, turn down for
It's on.
Green.
There we go. There we go. It works. All right. So a quick roadmap. So I'm going to today I'm going to talk about 3 studies, and actually the first 2 studies are direct test of 2 rival hypotheses that I see in the literature. And the third study is really try to expand and build on the first 2 studies and adding one more missing piece into the puzzle. And I'm going to conclude my talk by giving some key takeaways and where I am and where I'm going next. All right, let's vote really quick. All right, so which statement do you agree? Are you more likely or less likely to follow what others do when you feel physically threatened?
So all in favor of A, raise your hand.
Okay, A. The rest, B? Or no? B?
No.
So it looks like more people in favor of A and fewer people in favor of B. Is that fair to say? I think probably 1/3 are favor of B. All right. So I would like you to remember your vote, okay, and we'll come back to it. All right. Okay. Oh, obviously. Okay. So all of this really started when the pandemic hit, and I was teaching online at home and not much to do, and I was cooking while I listened to an audiobook. And the book is called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. And some of you are probably familiar with this book. And a very key concept that Dr. Gelfand proposed is a whipping culture difference, where she talks about tight versus loose culture. And if you think about the tight and loose culture, in tight culture, so that's where the social norms are clearly defined, right? And the compliance with the norms are expected. And people really are not given a lot of freedom to interpret, how they should perform or the other. And if they violate some of the norms, and they're more likely to be punished. Versus in loose culture, right? So the norms are more flexible and informal. And social norms are expectations where people have a wide range of behaviors and they can exercise their preferences, right? And I think we all see that in the pandemic, right? So the place where I grew up in China, I know that you all have seen the pictures online, right? People are wearing masks everywhere, and they're still locked down in their room, in their homes, if there is a positive case in their community. Right? And versus in the United States, it's widely open. And even think about face masking behavior, right? In China, you need to cover your mouth and nose. And here we see a lot of versions of it, right? You cover both, you cover one, or you don't at all. So typically we consider, a lot of cultures like Singapore, China tend to be more tight cultures. And the Western cultures like the United States are loose cultures. And let me give you some other example. Like Germany is considered as a tight culture. So you see the picture on your left. That's where a group of people are trying to cross the street, right? As you can see, there is no crossing traffic, right? They are still waiting there. Why? Because it's forbidden, right? The culture, the norm says you need to closely follow the rule. Whereas in the United States, right, that's where the right picture shows. I hope it's clear enough for you to see. Clearly, that's a red light, right? And there was a car running in front of you, and people are still crossing it. And we also see something like in Singapore, there are a lot of reasons for why people get fined, right? And in some loose cultures, you really have a lot of freedom, such as going to a restaurant barefooted, right? So I was really fascinated by this idea. And if you are interested in learning, and just so you know, the tight and loose culture really does not only operate in the national level, right? And in this study, Harrison and Gelfand, they actually look at the 50 states in the United States, where they actually kind of map out where each state is at in terms of its looseness versus tightness culture. So I think we can all agree, right? So where I'm from, Texas is likely to be a tighter culture, right? Whereas a lot of states in the coastal areas are loose culture. Where's Michigan?
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle. Yeah, right in the middle, pretty much. 27, right? And you see the mean score is right in the scantron. But that's not what I'm only interested in. So one thing that Gelfand brought up in her book is she talks about why in some cultures people form tight cultures, in some countries people form loose cultures. And for one reason that she talked about is for the cultures or countries that we observe tight cultures, they tend to historically experience more uncertainty and threats, right? The uncertainty threats including some natural disasters, right? Hunger, and even invasion. So that leads me to the question, okay, so we're in a pandemic and we're looking at all different ways people are practicing their behaviors. Does the social norms influence our behavior, really depending on to what extent people perceive the risk, right? If the risk is high, likely we are going to follow what other people do because that's a way that we seek protection. And even in Gelfand, she and her associates really reported the COVID-19 pandemic, where they associated the mortality and mortality rates of COVID-19 in different countries and correlate them with the country tightness versus looseness score. And what they have reported is that in the tight cultures, people tend to see lower mortality and mortality rates than the loose culture countries. And all of this really makes sense, right? All of this really makes sense. So I think we also in the literature, we tend to observe researchers report that people tend to have a greater tendency to comply with social norms, right? When they experience physical threats, their identity threats, or even some ambiguity in their environment. And even more directly, looks like I have to do it here. All right. And another theory is the terror management theory, right? So which says death is inevitable, right? We all have to face it one day, but we probably don't want to think about it. But when death is reminded, or when we make death the idea is salient, we really need to find ways to manage that terror. How do we do it? Right, so there are several ways, such as we engage in something like we try to follow what our in-group members do in order to protect our culture worldviews, or to buffer our self-esteem, right, or to engage in some close interpersonal relationship. So all of those are buffering systems that we engage in order to manage our anxiety. And actually, interestingly, several studies that have conducted under the premises of terror management theory actually shows when we remind people some threats like climate change, right? People are more likely to follow their in-group members, and they punish their in-group members for their violation of group norms. So that's the second piece of evidence that's supporting those of you who voted A, right? Even more directly, in this study, okay, I really practiced how to pronounce this author's last name. I think it's Griskevicius et al. So they actually tested very directly when people face external threats. So they put participants into a dark room and asked them to imagine a danger that's going to occur to them. And later they actually look at whether they're more or less likely to follow a group norm. Keep in mind, the norm was about whether the majority of the group like a painting or not. So it's different, right? So it's kind of unrelated to the threats that they have. But it seems like all three pieces of information, all three pieces of evidence that I cited here, so the tightness and looseness culture, the terror management theory, and this study that comes directly from the social norm literature, all suggesting this hypothesis, right? So the threat or the risk and descriptive norms interact to influence our behavior, such that when risk increases, the effect of descriptive norm also stronger, right? We're more likely to follow it. So far, so good? Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So I actually wondered, Dr. Levinsky is in the audience, right? So we did some discussion about the roles that descriptive norm versus injunctive norms play, right? So in the classic example of Cialdini and Posts, and where they talked about the descriptive norm is really just a heuristic cue. However, when people experience in heightened risk, right, they tend to scrutinize the information more carefully than just to let information pass it, right? So just based on this, it seems like the opposite prediction could be true, which is risk and descriptive norms still interact to influence behavior, but it's the opposite direction, right? So when risk increases, the effect of descriptive norms decreases. So in other words, I'm not going to follow what the norm says. I'm going to do what I think is right. Unfortunately, this particular hypothesis has not received much empirical support yet, and I don't think there is much direct testing to it either. So the example that I provide to you, which is more direct, but as I said, the content of descriptive norms and the risk, they're unrelated. So I feel like these two questions are puzzling to me, right? So I decided to conduct a couple of studies to test which one is right. All right, there we go. So study one. So I conducted a cross-sectional survey, and the data were collected during the third week of July 2020. So if you recall, that's where a lot of controversies were happening, and so I collected data from ACTURC. Obviously, a lot of, so in terms of gender, it's not really representative, and it's even worse with education background. I don't know what's happening. Almost 90% of my participants are 2-year or 4-year college educated. I think it's probably because that's why they are interested in this research, right? But that's a limitation to keep in mind. So I adopted those measures. So in this study, I actually measured descriptive norms for all 4 preventive behaviors, because I think it's, at that time, the descriptive norms for each preventive behavior might be a little bit different. And I measured perceived severity and susceptibility and behavior intention to engage in those 4 preventive measures. All right, give a really quick shot, and I think it's the highlight of this research. So if you see here, obviously the descriptive norm had a pretty consistent impact on all 4 behaviors. Very surprisingly, susceptibility, right, to what extent you are likely to contract the COVID-19, only impacted the face masking and hand hygiene, but in a negative way. I double-checked my coding and I think I was right, but it was quite surprising to me. And severity was a strong predictor, but I think what's most interesting here is the interaction that I see between descriptive norm and severity. And stay hold, and I'm going to show you what those patterns look like. So I decomposed the interaction, and here's what I found. And keep in mind, the solid line indicates the people who don't necessarily think COVID-19 is a severe threat, and the dotted line means the high severity. Pretty consistent. What this data shows is when people consider COVID-19 is not a severe disease, they are more likely to follow descriptive norms. but we don't necessarily see that trend with people who have high severity. So it seems like this set of data lends support to the second hypothesis, right? So we are more likely to engage and to follow the norms when the risk is relatively low, but not the opposite. All right. Okay, study 2. So I did a little experiment because I wanted to see, because in the first study, it was mainly about perceptual descriptive norms and risk factors. And in this study, I want to look at whether by presenting people different messages, right, can change their behavior outcomes or not. So in this study, the data were collected in later 2020. And in the institution where I work, so that's the group of undergrad students that I recruited. So just to give you a little background there, so in the institute where I work at, so there is still a mask mandate in classroom, indoors, but not outdoors. All right, but not outdoors. And the mask mandate in other areas such as grocery stores are loosened up a little bit too. Some information about the participants and measures, but in this study, I added another measure, which is intention to begin preventive measures. And I differentiate that from intention to continue. Because I think at that moment, it's important to look at whether people are going to engage, right? Start to engage, because we already see a lot of political ideology, political debates, and all the health measures are becoming political sized. So that's a differentiation that I want to make. And I also measured argument strength as a potential covariates there. So that's that. Give you a little bit sense about the message stimuli. So this is an example of COVID-19. Let me go back a little bit. So in this study, I actually employed another topic, which is meningitis. So I want to see whether the pattern still holds in the different disease condition. So this is how I manipulated risk in the COVID-19 situation. Obviously, so in this high risk condition, I highlighted the health outcomes of COVID-19 for this group of participants, right, undergrad students. And in the low risk condition, I kind of downplayed how COVID-19 can impact them. And this is how I manipulated meningitis risk, right? So in the low risk condition, the meningitis is particularly threatening for adolescents, but not necessarily for college students. But I highlighted that in the high risk condition. All right, norms. In the high norms condition, so instead of talking about the majority of people are doing it, I think that's probably going to create a little bit of discrepancy with the participants, because their observation might be, not many of my peers are doing it, right? So instead, I said more and more young adults like you across the nation are engaging in those behaviors. And in the low norms condition, I said no, not many people are doing it. Similarly, in the meningitis norms condition, again, the same language, more and more college students, and in a low norms condition, it says not many of them. Okay. So this is a quick show to that the randomization worked, right? Not many difference across their demographic information. And this is the result of manipulation check. And I want to highlight that for the descriptive norms condition, it does not only influence their perceived descriptive norms, but also influence their perceived injunctive norms. So in my analysis, I controlled for the effect of perceived injunctive norms. And for the risk manipulation, it only affected their perceived severity, but not susceptibility. All right, so that's another thing to keep in mind too. Okay, some quick results. So for the COVID-19 condition, for the behavior intention to continue a preventive behavior, we don't see any results. Not good. All right, but that's okay. Which is also true for the meningitis. Well, but when it goes to begin to engage in the preventive behavior, we do see an interaction here. And this is what the interaction looks like. When risk is low, the descriptive norm has a stronger effect, right? When risk is high, the effect reversed. But I made the sample size red because that's something to keep in mind. This study is likely to be underpowered. So I'm doing a replication study with this. And we also see the same effect for behavior intention to begin preventive behaviors against meningitis. That's the same pattern. Are you changing your mind yet? We'll see. All right, we'll see. Okay, so as I said, so after the two studies, I'm pretty convinced. Okay, it seems like the second hypothesis was right. And it actually makes sense if you think about it. Is when people's risk is high, it's not that they are dealing with ambiguity or uncertainty anymore, right? They are sure that they are at high risk. So regardless of the social norm, I'm going to do what is right for me. Versus when people's risk is lower, that's where they are trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. That's what the right thing to do. So, so for a lot of you are familiar with EPPM, obviously, right? So you know, like by now, seems like my study is missing one important piece, which is efficacy, right? And actually, in the literature, Dr. Smith is here. So they actually look at some interactions between descriptive norm and efficacy or perceived behavior control. And in one study by Park and Smith on organ donation, they actually found in that case, they used the perceived behavior control, which is conceptually similar with efficacy, right? They actually found that perceived efficacy can strengthen the effect of descriptive norms on intention to become an organ donor. But in another study, we found the opposite, right? So efficacy weakens the effect of descriptive norms on hand washing and face masking, but not on the other two COVID-19 preventive behaviors. So what is going on? Maybe it's because they didn't look at risk. So I really don't have a clear pattern or clear hypothesis that allow me to map out the pattern of the three-way interaction, but I do wonder whether the nature of the interaction between risk and descriptive norms that I observed in the previous two studies very depends on people's perceived efficacy. And another question that I'm interested in this particular study is different levels of norms, right? Again, if we're looking at the pandemic, right? So where I am, like what my family, what my friends believe might be totally different than what my university or what people in Texas believe, right? Which is totally different than the societal norm. So in this study, I look at whether the three-way interactions between descriptive norm, risk, and efficacy, the nature of that interaction changes at different levels of social norms as well. All right, so then again, I want to acknowledge my great colleagues at Texas Christian University and the University of Arkansas. So we collected data on both campus during this time period. So we were able to get a little bit over 600 participants, and we employed all the measures that I listed here. So I want to mention that we kind of extended, Park and Smith to 2007 by adding one more layer of social norms between personal and societal. So we look at community level social norms too. Something that I want to mention before I present you the findings is that so if you just to kind of visualize our survey with me for a second. Okay, so we have the personal level, descriptive norm, injunctive norm. We have the community level, descriptive norm and injunctive norm, and we have societal level, descriptive norm and injunctive norms. So before we tested any of our hypotheses, we had to demonstrate that the norms at each level, right, the three-factor model in that way, fits the data better than if we look at both types of norms at different levels. So in other words, six-factor levels, right? Or if we group the descriptive norms at all three levels and injunctive norms at all three levels to fit a two-factor level model. Is that clear enough? So the data actually shows that a three-factor model, which means at the personal level, we combine the personal level descriptive, injunctive. Community level, we grouped the community level descriptive and injunctive, and societal level descriptive and injunctive norms. And this model actually fits the data better than other alternative models. So we went ahead with this, and we tested the measurement model prior to analyzing the data. And if you're interested in the results, I'm more than happy to share afterwards. And I want to mention, okay, so in this table, I only present the results of the three-way interaction that I'm mostly interested in. But we did include the main effect, the two-way interactions, and the three-way interactions in our analysis. And it turns out that none of the two-way interactions was significant. Right? So always the findings actually show significant three-way interactions at the personal and the community level, not at the societal level. Okay, so that's the T that we see. All right, what that looks like. Here we go. So, all right, I'm trying to figure. I tried to figure out how to better visualize this, but I think I can do it. All right, so this panel really just shows the three-way interaction between social norms at personal level and risk and efficacy. And if you recall, I think we are kind of familiar with this pattern, right? So the low severity, you see a steeper slope than the higher severity or higher risk. But it only happens when the efficacy is high. Versus so there is no interaction when the efficacy is at a medium. Low efficacy, it changed a little bit because when people are having low efficacy, when the risk is high, we see a steeper slope than when the risk is low. All right, here's what the community norms looks like. The only difference, the only significant interaction is at high efficacy. There is no effect of social norms when people's risk is high. But there is an effect for social norms when people's norms, perceived community norms when people's risk is low. But that only happens in high efficacy. And we don't see that in low efficacy. And those interactions, two-way interactions, are not significant. Is that good so far? All right. To be super honest, I'm still trying to make sense of the data and make sense of what are some takeaways, but I think it is good for me to share a couple. So I think the data across 3 studies do show the second hypothesis was probably right. There was a pretty clear pattern there, and across study 1 and study 2, the attenuation effects that we see between risk and descriptive norm is driven by severity, but not by susceptibility. So if you recall in study 1, there is no interaction between susceptibility and descriptive norm whatsoever. Very consistent between severity and descriptive norms. efficacy can alter the nature, right? So in this case, so we see as the efficacy goes higher, probably the norm's impact is lower. And also, as efficacy and risk goes higher, the norm's impact goes lower. But not when the efficacy is low. But not when efficacy is low. All right. That's it. What's next? Obviously, I'm going to do replicate study 2 with a bigger sample. Really, by that time, 369 participants. That's all I can get. But because of the design, it really lands the study underpowered. So I would like to replicate the study in a different context in a way, and also incorporate, the information processing into the study to see the underlying mechanism there. And if I think all of you are very familiar with the literature, risk and EPPM, right, and social norms. And I think it's fair to say so far both literatures are kind of parallel to each other to predict behavior. So I would like to investigate more and bringing those two literatures together. Right. So if you are interested, some references there. Thank you so much.
I have a question, Jackie. The last study was a little bit puzzling the way things came out, but let me see if I can try and make sense of what I understand and see if it's what you understand too. So those were all perceived norms. Those weren't actual norms in the community, but the way people perceive
Correct.
their personal and their,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
So if I can, if we have a pandemic or some other crisis, and I can teach people how to handle whatever these issues are in an efficacious way that's going to lower their risk.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be something good because, now you have to help me here, because when there's high efficacy, fill in the blanks. Or
Okay, when there is high efficacy, people who are at lower risk are more likely to follow the norms in the community.
people at lower risk.
But I thought it was the same for low, moderate, and high risk for high efficacy and high norms. They all met at the top, right?
Okay. Let me find.
We're almost there. There we
That's
are.
right.
Yeah. Well, they did for personal norms.
Oh, right, and you were talking about community.
No, I'm trying to get to that high efficacy and to try and figure out, okay, we always want to teach people to feel efficacious and to truly be efficacious.
Yeah.
And then I was just trying to look at, so are people perceiving they're at high risk or you told them they're at high risk?
This study is all perceptual. It's only study 2 was the message based.
Okay. So,
In your earlier study, you talked about risk in terms of both severity and susceptibility. What do you mean by high risk here?
Yeah, so in this study, I standardized severity and susceptibility and averaged them. So that's how I take the risk score.
I'm glad I asked because this is something that Eugen and Maria and I have probably talked about a lot, which is what does risk really mean, right?
Yeah.
Now, both when, Slovic as well as Witty and others talk about it, they don't necessarily use the mathematical language, but they talk about it as a product, right? When do you feel at risk? When you feel personally vulnerable to a severe outcome. So if something's really severe, but I don't think it's going to happen to me, like a tsunami, I'm really not at risk even though that is severe. Yeah. And likewise susceptible to something not so severe, maybe like the common flu, unless I have some other comorbidity, let's put that aside. Mm-hmm. Also right? Yeah. So I wonder what would happen if you took the product.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So to be super honest, when I analyzed the data to try to answer my research question, I think I was torn because now we have 3 levels of
Yeah,
norms,
It's
right?
a three-way interaction now.
And we have susceptibility, severity, even efficacy. We have response and self-efficacy. So I think I'm trying to keep a balance between whether the data makes sense statistically and conceptually.
Yeah.
Right? Because if I treat the severity and susceptibility separately, and I do interactions, and now all of a sudden we have several 4-way interactions too.
Yeah. So if I
No, but
follow up, would that be? I'm looking because I imagine you might have some questions too. We have the row norms and risk people here, but so I mean, what I'm actually talking about is more of a theoretical issue, right?
Absolutely.
Like, is just severity actually risk? Is just susceptibility actually risk? And the reason this is important in this context comes out of some of the work we've done out of our NSF COVID grant, where and this will we can tie this back to Dr. Hunt, right? So we found that when people perceived something was pretty severe, but not for them, and that was the case with a lot of our MSU students because we did study them quite a lot. And so they thought this is really bad for other people. What we found is their moral norms were actually guiding their behavior more than anything else. And so they weren't wearing masks or engaging in other behaviors because they felt a physical threat. They felt morally responsible for us, faculty and staff and other people. And so that's under review right now. Hopefully that'll get published. But there's a different equation going on in people's minds if they don't feel a severe risk for an infectious disease. Very different than a non-infectious disease. So just some food for thought for your next set of studies.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think because when I designed a study, like moral norms is another norm that I have taken into consideration as well.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, sounds good. Yes, Winston.
Yeah, so I try to understand what these two interaction effects mean. So for the high efficacy group, it seems to suggest that the impact of personal norms on their intention is decreasing when the risk is higher. Right?
Correct.
So that means when the risk is very low, the impact of personal norms is stronger. So that means they are more guided by the norm when the risk is low.
Correct.
And when the risk is high, norm plays a much weaker role here.
Correct. Yeah.
Her number 2 competing hypothesis, I think, right?
Which kind of flies in the face of some of the evolutionary stuff on social norms that really says the reason we started following norms was to protect ourselves from, the mammoth that's chasing us through the, the woods or whatever, the high risk scenarios.
Sure. Yeah.
But maybe we've evolved to the point where we're thinking, oh, hey, this is really scary, but I think I know what to do. I'm not going to follow everybody
Yeah.
else.
Right.
Because I have high efficacy right here.
Right.
Yeah.
See, it's just the high efficacy group that's thinking that.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah, I've got it.
This is a very individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think when I started the whole series of studies, I was a firm believer of each one. I was a firm believer. Of course, right? I'm going to protect myself, and one way to do it is I'm going to follow what other people do. But then I think it makes sense if we think about when the risk is high, I don't care what other people are doing.
And I think I know what to do. I know
Exactly.
applications. That's in that group, yeah.
Exactly.
And more interestingly, what you find for the low efficacy group, just reverse the story.
Yes, but that only happens for the personal norm condition,
Yes,
and not
yes.
the community. Yes.
A follow-up question is that what's the correlation between the personal norm and the community norm?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we actually checked it. I think it's in the 0.4 range. Yeah. I can get the exact number to you, but I think it's in the 0.4 range.
From a theoretical perspective, our personal norm will be part of the community norm. And so I don't want to put you to a four-way interaction. That's something.
Yes, you do.
We have a
Just
global
triple that sample
environment,
size.
and we have a local environment. They
Yes.
too, you cannot completely detect them, and you need to consider both of them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one thing that I mentioned was, so we did test the measurement model and the structure, the factor structure. So the way that we treated the norms at 3 levels actually fits the data better than other options. But I understand it's really just an empirical argument, not theoretical argument.
Question.
Yeah.
Your study 2, you were showing this effect. Maybe you can go to that slide because it'll help me ask the question a little better. Because I wondered if or maybe it was study 1. Because
So study 2 is an experiment. Study
maybe it
1
was
is
study 1.
study 1.
Because what I'm wondering is are you actually finding that the endpoint, when you showed the flip, you showed the interaction, it almost seemed like what we could, here. I'm looking at those folks in the high group, and I'm wondering if those points, are they clustering around each other such that there is no difference between the groups at that point? Or are we really able to extrapolate and say, it turns out that people who have low severity and high norms are actually more likely to face next, for example? Because that's a different interpretation than just they'll fall in line with what we want them to do anyways. Because it's fascinating how it's happening, that these are folks who will not do these things. Right, and I'm trying to place that together. Like, when we get this back end on the high side, right? Because if you look at your scale, right, there's not a whole lot more room to go. Right? You're quickly getting to the top of your scale. So, are those points on that end? Are they going to break from each other, or is it maybe a non-disorderly interaction, right, where they're different on one side but not the other side?
Oh, that's a great thought. Yeah.
Because it might be a very different story in terms of like they're converging on. Because yes, we're seeing the interaction, but like I said, we're also hitting the ceiling. So I'm just trying to think of ways we could potentially unpack that to where we're seeing it on both sides.
I see. No, that's a great point, I think.
Because they're very clear on the low side, right? It's very obvious just looking at the charts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I see what you mean.
I just wonder at the end, this is a bit out of my water, of course, but I'm just curious what that would mean for going into the study 2 and the study 3 and beyond. Because something you said a moment ago, I was wondering, is it just that they're actually converging on the effect we hope them to see, or is it really the case that H2 is this clean prediction by itself?
Exactly. No, I think again, obviously this is a more optimistic study, right? So I was randomly listening to this book and thought about this idea. But I think this is I think both hypotheses makes logical sense. I think they do. But I mean, again, in the studies that supporting H1, right? So they are more interested in, okay, if I put people in a dangerous situation, are they more likely just to follow whatever social norms or in-group norms, right? It's not related to how to mitigate the risk at all. But in this study, actually another study that just published in last year in PLOS-1, and that's another study that showed the similar pattern, but the norms and the risk are in the same context.
I'm just thinking about, I was living in Texas very recently, and this is somewhat encouraging because we are both around people who are definitely that bold black line, right? And they will not put on a face mask and they won't wash their hands. So when I see data like this, I'm like, we can actually get you to do this? Like, that's a possibility? And that's what you're showing. They're behaving.
The study 1 was amateur.
wasn't it?
Mrs. Emper.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right.
Right.
Oh, that was the educated population.
Yeah.
Yeah, educated.
That was an implicit
Educated
statement, came out
women.
wrong, but
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Oh, actually men. I have more
Educated
men.
men,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah, women. Yeah, no, but another thing that I think I want to point out a little bit is, if we look at interactions between risk and norms across study 1 and study 2, they show more consistent pattern than the study 2. Well, sorry, study 1 and study 3. So actually study 2, sorry, I have to flip my slides here. Which is like X, right? Not only people are less likely to follow norms, they just decided not to, for people who are at high risk. Versus in study 1 and study 2, it's just the effect is weaker. So the pattern there is a little bit different there.
While you're here, I had a question about this effect.
Yeah.
So the interaction is significant, but did you actually estimate whether that negative trend line is significant for those who have high risk?
Yeah.
So those are both significant.
Yes.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yes.
Because sometimes we'll see those interactions that are significant, but then
Yeah, it can be like
Yeah.
this or this,
Yeah.
right? But this is very clear. Like, yeah.
you anticipated my question, so thank you.
Well, the other thing to note, I always like to go back and to see relative to the range of the scale
Yeah.
where my findings are, and yours are all below the midpoint of the scale.
Well, keep in mind, this is whether they begin to engage in
Oh, okay.
behavior.
Well, that makes a lot more sense. Begin to. I didn't.
Yeah, this is begin.
Begin. Okay.
Mm.
Well, then it makes sense there. But I think we always need to contextualize things. Like we can say, there's this strong interaction effect, blah blah blah. But it's only occurring in this region.
Yes.
That range.
Yeah. So was this question then only asked to people that hadn't begun?
Yeah, so the way that I set up the survey was, I asked them whether they are currently engaging in any of the prevented behaviors, and for folks who didn't choose any, I asked them whether they are going to.
Gotcha. Okay, so that is a very interesting group.
Yeah, that's why, the sample size for that group is quite low.
Yeah.
Still-
Look at the degrees of
Yeah.
Huh. Did you expect the results can be helped with robust if you change the dependent variable to intention to continue preventive behavior?
Well, actually, I had it, but no. For study 2, I didn't find any effect for continue.
For either meningitis
Or
or
either.
COVID?
Yeah, but I think, again, given the data collection point, right? So it's so now we're into the pandemic for almost a whole year. Right? People are doing it, I'm keep doing it, right?
Yeah.
So that's probably an explanation.
Ask people now. Right, they're like-
In Texas.
Yeah.
Really interesting stuff
Interesting.
there.
Thank you so much. All right, we have some break time. Between talks.
Did you have something about seceding from the Texas?
Yes.
It cracked me up because then I saw this and thinking, we're hearing a lot about that state today.
I was like, we're not trying hard enough.
And was yours on a
Jackie
10-point
should measure
scale?
that
Some of yours
control
were 10 points, some
Yes.
of them.
Every
Yeah.
I came to him. Oh, okay.
I didn't even know what the position was.
I still don't know. Find out
If you want to get your
No,
PhD,
I've never
if you
worked with
want,
them.
if you want to get your PhD, you do not have to get into advice. I want you to know. In Chinese. Nick is an old friend.
How you been? Been all right. Been all right.
How's this guy?
I'm okay. You're not ready to discuss. You're not talking. Oh, you're not ready to discuss right now.
I'm learning about video games, but not quite done.
I'm sure we're actually talking about this is a ball here. This is a beam. Like halfway through, I get up. He's like, actually, we didn't finish the paper. I practiced.
I never formatted it. I never formatted it.
Actually,
I wrote it, got defended, never
I
formatted
think
it.
I might have been the person because he laughed. I think I'm the one that actually ran across the street to submit it and format it. That might be their fault. It could be. I probably would have explicitly.
I feel like I need some.
And so Mark told me this.
Right? People who are like, I defended this and I've done everything I wanted to. I'm so tired of forming this shit.
That's a weird hill to die on.
People have died on weirder. Just like the pandemic.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our last session. First, I want to introduce this fantastic last speaker for you. But first, let me tell you about all the impressive things you can discover about Dr. Nick Bowman from his CV. Okay? So Dr. Nick Bowman earned his BA and MA from the University of Missouri St. Louis, received his PhD from MSU in 09-ish, 10-ish. He's currently an associate professor at Syracuse University Newhouse School of Public Communications. I'm just going to say, where's Tommy? Because she's got her shirt on. Dr. Bowman's research is broadly focused on understanding cognitive, emotional, physical, and social demands of interactive media content. He's published more than 125 peer-reviewed manuscripts, over 200 conference presentations, several dozen book chapters, and a handful of books, including a new Handbook of Media Entertainment, expected in 2023, non-sponsored plug. He has won numerous teaching and research awards. He was named a Fulbright Taiwan Wu-Jing-Ji Arts and Culture Fellow in the spring of 2020. He was editor-in-chief for Communication Research Reports from 2017 to 2019 and is the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Media Psychology and an associate editor of the Registered Reports for the Journal of Technology, Mind, and Behavior. So if you're not already impressed, which maybe you should be, let me tell you a few things that you may not find on his CV, but you might find it on Twitter. There we go. Dr. Bowman is quite possibly the most social person in the communication discipline, which is quite maybe a feat. If you can't find him at the next ICR or NCA, you can look for one of two things. So first, a crowd of people who actually look happy to be there. Or second, the vest and scarf combo. Yeah. Let me say, when I wrote this, I wasn't expecting a tie. Okay. But neck apparel maybe works. All jokes aside, Dr. Bowman has always been an advocate for our program. His pride in this department and in this university has quite literally reached around the world. We are so incredibly lucky to have him here today as our speaker for the Charles K. Atkins Speaker Series. You know him, you love him. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bowman.
Thanks for that. And I had to reveal a couple of things that might surprise people in this room. I'm normally known for being fairly confident, and I have been a bit nervous today. I feel like I'm defending my dissertation again. And there's like this slight twinge that like number can go away if something goes wrong. And I usually have plenty to talk about. That doesn't shock many people. And I'm actually stumbling up my words a little bit today. I've actually been a little quiet and coy around the building as I had this nostalgia flood coming back that I wasn't expecting. And I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to work through 15 or so years of research that it never was planned as a line of work. You find things that interest you and you follow up with those things and you find new things and then those things are interesting and then you follow up with them. And when you look back, like when you go for promotion and tenure, you are forced to tell a story. So if it doesn't fit a narrative, you better fit a regression line now because you're going in front of a board. And it talks like this. It's like, all right, now what do you really do? I'm like, oh. And so I've been going through these papers and I'm reading my own work and I'm realizing how much of your own work you forget. You read a paper and I'm like, I made that claim. And I'm putting it back into this narrative. And I'm not done yet. And I mean it when I say that this work came from here. It came from being lost. It came from leaving a job in media and moving to Michigan, to which my parents replied, so you have a college degree and you live on your own. You don't live here. Why are you going back to college? You don't have to do that. You already have done this thing. To figuring out we can do social science research on these phenomena that we often are so mundane we don't think about them, but yet they're so powerful. I mean, the folks who study entertainment face this conundrum. When someone goes, what do you study? I'm like, television and games and entertainment. And they go, har. I'm like, yeah, but you spend a good third of your day with this stuff. And if you read the headlines, what are you concerned about? What are you arguing about? What are we arguing over? Where are the policy debates going on? Right? So let's talk a bit about that journey and connect it to my research and close by essentially soliciting more research from you, from me, from us. If there's nothing else I enjoy is collaboration. It's one reason I've moved a little bit. I haven't always been able to find collaborators. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to talk about video games as this interactive medium that, I don't know, it fascinates me. I mean, as a kid down in the basement, grabbing a controller and realizing that I have some control over this. I don't have control over a whole lot. Right, but I can control this for these couple of minutes. I can push these buttons, I can do these things. I can win or lose, I can be frustrated, I can be happy. And I guess I had the privilege of growing up to watch games become increasingly complicated. 4-bit, 8-bit, 16-bit, 3D, gloves, goggles, treadmills. And I'm getting to the point where I don't like it and I'm shaking my fist. The games are too complicated today. But what I'm noticing in the development of the technology is, of course, the tech is developed, and the user experience is supposed to be part of that technology development, and it isn't always part of that development. And now we're getting to this multi-billion-dollar industry where we're making all these amazing, immersive, interactive, et cetera, experiences, and we're not quite sure what the users do with those anymore. They're kind of spread all over the place. And I sometimes wonder if we're putting too much pressure on the player, on the user. And if we're matching up what we intended to design with what they're experiencing. And I'll talk about this in terms of demand with an intentionally negative connotation. Maybe we're asking for things that the user didn't agree to when they put that game in or turned on that program. And it might be leading to outcomes that you weren't expecting. Or it could lead to better outcomes if it was balanced better. And I'm going to cop out when I close and say that we're still working on it. But we are still working on it. Okay, I'm going to come back to all this. So, well, I love that you did that because this is the first slide that I made, and I actually got a little emotional making it. I tried to find the overhead. Like somewhere online, there's got to be that 4th grade overhead of the United States that I could find. I almost emailed the department saying, "Need me a copy of it." So I was born in Arkansas in Conway to an immigrant father and a mother from a broken Italian household, and they just sort of figured it out, and we moved to St. Louis. And I never thought I would leave. UPS had just opened a facility. You drive a truck for like $30 an hour, and that's pretty neat. And I went to college because I didn't want to work part-time at night. And I sort of really enjoyed journalism. And I went to graduate school after that because I wanted to, frankly, make myself more marketable in a media career. I took a course on media at Dr. Alice Hall and didn't like it. So I'm like, I work in the media. Those theories don't affect me. Come on, you don't know. You don't work in a newspaper. I work in a newspaper. And I learned very quickly that she was right. There was a lot of theory. Whether you know theory or not, it still exists. It still influences you. So it's a lot better if you can get in front of it and figure out some of these, descriptive, predictive, explanatory, and controlling features of our social world. And I put 2.5 up here because I went to Chicago for NCA, And I met a couple of folks in this dark hotel room with lots of bottles of non-alcoholic and alcoholic beer talking about research that I had just learned a couple of weeks ago. And it was the Michigan State reception. And I met up with a lot of faculty, John Sherry and Ron Tamburini and Dave Westerman, students, Mike Katowski, and they were all talking about media research, and Paul Skalski was there. I didn't know people studied this stuff. I didn't know they studied it and cared about it enough to talk about it over beer at night. And then they make fun of each other. Then they talk about the research some more. And so I started talking to them, and I talked to Ron, and I talked to John. And before you know it, I put an application in, and I came to East Lansing. And I didn't quite know what I was doing there, and I'll get to where I went from there eventually. That's going to be the meat of the conversation. So I come here, I really transform as a scholar, as a person. I didn't give it a valence, that's up for you to decide. And took a job on a black bear reservation at a school of 800 people in North Georgia, because I decided to go on the market in 2009. So you can go back and follow the economics of that time. Went up the Appalachian Trail to West Virginia University, spent about a decade there. That's where I did my tenure. It's where I built my first lab. It's where I really got to get the ball rolling. Never thought I would leave, frankly. It's a nice, confident R1 near Pittsburgh, fun town, lovely place. And I looked for a new opportunity out west, and I moved right back over here. In the middle of all of that, I went over to Germany. And so my German colleagues are thinking, why is Thuringia highlighted on the map of Germany? Why would an American go to this it's this effort of all the cities? It's not the one we heard of. I spent some time in Taipei as a Fulbright scholar, and now I'm actually down the road with a slightly different S. If you look real close, this is a square, and that's a rectangle. And when they both use white ones, that really throws me off. Like, all right, listen, that's too far. Right? I'm down the road, I'm around the corner, and I'm really happy to do that. So when I first got to Michigan State, they threw me into a lab. John Sherry was running a study on sex differences in cognition in video games. And I didn't know what any of those things meant except video games. And what I learned through the research that he was trying to figure out is whether or not generalized cognitive abilities, mental rotation ability, hand-eye coordination, verbal skills, certain abilities that we know have some biological differences would correlate and predict gameplay. So for example, you might expect your ability to rotate 2D objects in your head and see them in 3D and select the proper rotations is very similar to how you would navigate a flat screen in 3-dimensional space, which is essentially a shooting game. And we didn't use a shooting game, we actually used a maze and a ball, but I couldn't find it anywhere online. It's been quite a while. And we found that these generalized cognitive skills were predictive of performance. And if you control for game skill, the sex difference went away. Because the brain is pliable. You can work those regions over time, and then you work through this. Right? This was never published, but it's what sent me to Germany the first time for ICA 2006 in the world's hottest conference center. For those who went. Yeah. But it got me thinking about how people engage games, and not just as that thing I did when I was mad at mom and dad or getting away from college, although we're going to come back to that one too. So this gets me thinking about gaming, about some of the personological differences that get into gaming. And then I start attaching my research to my coursework and trying to find those intersections. And so 802, we're talking about different social theories that might explain behaviors. I learned about social facilitation theory. This idea that right now, when people are watching you and they're around you, you try a little harder, which can work really well in your favor if the dominant response to that drive is going to facilitate performance. It can also make you fall on your butt. And again, we still have quite a while, so we'll see. I didn't know that this was a training field for a doctoral education at a large Midwestern institution. But it worked out, and what we found out in the study, did an experiment, brought people into a lab. We had them play video games in the GR Miller lab, either by themselves or in front of other people. We gave them a cognitive skills battery, where we did mental rotation tests, fixed eye ability, moving eye ability. We had some axe handles glued to the ceiling of the GR Miller lab with little Velcro circles and an underhand motion. You would hit them with a tennis ball. It actually correlates to your performance as a 3D shooter, because you have to be able to move a target and shoot it. Chuck's face when I was throwing things at people, as you walk by the lab, there's tennis balls everywhere. And I had to explain why my receipts all came from Home Depot. My research. We used the Cracker, the Purdue pegboard test. I couldn't afford the Purdue pegboard test, so I grabbed a Cracker Barrel square. And measure how fast you could put the little pegs in and take the little pegs back out. Fine motor skill. And then catching rulers falling from the ceiling. And the paper explains how all these generalized cognitive abilities would be predictive of performance in a 3D environment. And it turns out rotation ability and hand-eye targeting were predictive. And when the game was easy, so was audience presence. Being in front of people triggered that effort, which triggered those cognitive abilities, which went right into the video game. And of course, when the game was hard, the audience effect was lost. And one reason is that the game was already pretty hard and your skills were already taking over. Where I'm going with all of this, of course, is that we're identifying other things the game requires of you to perform the task in front of you. Step into 992, a seminar on entertainment theory, which has been quite formative in my career, frankly. We had Peter Morter as a guest speaker and Art Rainey and Mary Beth Oliver. I think I also found the syllabus recently. We were kind of going through this kind of golden course that we took as students. And I came across two articles that really stuck with me. And one was by Chuck on our learned expectations of entertainment media, that we can learn this utilitarian role that certain messages play to seek out specific needs. And the other one, I think I may have made Ron mad because I got into an argument with James Bryant about
You didn't know it was Jennings.
I didn't know it was Jennings. That's the best part. Like, some guy talking about this theory that I read last week. So obviously, who's he? And it turns out he's Jennings, a great guy. If you're not kidding. And we did become very close friends. My first encounter, I got onto him because he didn't study video games. And his response was, Nick, this was published in 1985. If you want to study video games, you should just do that. And then write your version. I'm like, it's not bad advice. And then Ron's like, do you know that? Like, I didn't. But I put these two things together. They resonated with me. I have these documents on my computer. I've got the printed out versions. And I really wanted to see, okay, what are we learning about games from our prior exposure? This thing called intervention potential, the ability for a message to absorb your attentional resources to distract you from the root cause of your negative moods. That to me just sounded like interactivity. I mean, if you've ever tried to play a video game and do something else, it's really, really hard. And so I really got to thinking that if we can control other features of the game, boy, when I got to sit down and focus and push these buttons and really zone in, that should get my mind off of things. And so I put together the world's stupidest perspectives. This is an induction for bewilderment, because I saw my committee try not to explode. As I proposed this within subjects, 20 minutes, measure a bunch of things I made up last week, and then we'll just bring people to the lab for a week straight, every single day, Monday through Friday. We'll give them extra credit. Of course they'll come, and they'll come play games on Monday and Tuesday, and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and spell out my scales, and I'll graduate on time. And Ron did say before Halloween 2008, you really shouldn't propose this. I think it's a bit much. I'm like, no. I'm dead set that this is going to be my, look, my prelim went so well. It did go well. It was in media psychology. Well, this obviously would be nature. And they beat me up pretty bad. I forgot Occam's razor. I forgot through my philosophy of science books and my logic of using books, but I did. Ron, Frank, John Sherry, Renee Faber, Frank Bioga.
Yeah.
And they just had exchanged eyes at each other. And they're finally not at me anymore, just at each other. You don't want a silent committee. That's not looking good. But we say some things out of it. And I continue to think about demand, interactivity, and what is it the games take from us that changes the experience. We boiled it down to these notions of mood management and mood repair. That if people are in bad moods, we can experimentally induce boredom and anxiety, despite what IRB would tell you. Boredom, you give people a bowl of washers and like nearly infinite long piece of string. And you ask them to thread the washers and you'll come back a little later. And people will do it. Lab coat effect. And you measure their heart rate and it actually drops and it worked really well. And in anxiety, you give them a GRE type exam and you tell them that 75% of students at this university have no problem completing this exam. Then you leave the room for 20 minutes. Except a little buzzer goes off at 40 seconds and 190 seconds and 20 seconds. And we actually made it more stressful now because they give you dry erase markers to do all of your long math on and all of your word problems. And you flip the markers over. And these inductions work really well. And we wonder, okay, now I've got you bored and I've got you really stressed out. I should be able to manipulate the intervention potential of this message, how much attention it requires from you. And I realize that word can be used in very different ways. And the more absorbing the experience is, the better it should be at repairing your mood. And I thought it'd be linear because video games are the greatest thing. Research can be dangerous sometimes. So what we found is it's linear to a point, and then it drops down. It's curvilinear because it turns out at really high levels of how much you have to do in the game, it just turns into another point of stress. So this was a flight simulator where you either just watched it to simulate television watching, you had your hands on the controls, but the plane mostly flew itself. You had to control just like the stick and the speed. Everything else is automatic, or you had to control the stick, the speed, the flippers, the switches, the landing gear, the parachutes, the whole shebang. In all of this research, we found in the first study that, in fact, you would see, better mood repair, better mood repair, better mood repair, then it would drop off. And then for bored individuals, it was better because, of course, they had a lot less stress and arousal in their mood, whereas the game becomes a source of stress and arousal. So we found this non-disorderable interaction, non-disorderable curvilinear interaction. I got to learn all those words. But it was a neat finding. And it's also a reminder that sometimes in 2x2s you miss things. And you can't really test those curvilinear effects beyond that. This was a neat finding in study 1. And in study 3, we actually let people choose the game. That was Chuck's part, the learned expectation part. And sure enough, the people's choices they would make about which game they wanted to play after getting a chance to play were more or less in line with the mood repair scores up in study 1. Study 2 is blurred out. I promised Ron when I graduated that this would also get published. And it was a coding of people's hands on the controls to see if the amount of movement in their hands was predictive of mood repair. And that data is still sitting on my desk, and it's in a series of those mini discs. There's 12 of them. And I'm not kidding, it's actually still on my desk with a Post-it note on it. But it has been a while. So I've not violated my promise yet. But this was something where we found that this intervention potential, this focus the game requires, can have this really neat mood repair effect. But it can also be bad for us if it's too much to do. But if you're making a simulator or a game, don't you want the player to do all of it? That's what makes it fantasy. Not really, right? If I don't know how to fly a plane, and you give me a plane that's a one-to-one match to a plane, I'm going to crash that one too, or I'm not going to fly that one either. It's every bit as frustrating. So again, it's got me thinking about my research, about whether or not there's something about, can games be too much? Is there some sweet spot in terms of how much you get involved with the game, however you're defining involved? So we looked at, after I left, I did some work on interactive stories. The story is co-authored by definition. You make choices, those choices unfold the story and you move through it. I had learned about morality while I was here, right, from many of the folks in this room. And we did a study, although Ron's name isn't on this, I did call him at 6 a.m. from a diner to ask for some analysis feedback on a paper. We looked at moral salience and observed decision-making. One of the things we found is that when people have a strong salient moral foundation, they won't violate that in the game. Whereas if their foundations are lower, they won't automatically violate, they just do something. I wouldn't call it random. It just satisfies it. I just want to see what happens. So it's not moral and immoral. It's moral and amoral. We're looking at probabilities. Right, that was kind of neat. There was a biasing factor, but not necessarily. And we were replicating some other research. I think Lindsay did a study where we were able to make it temporarily accessible by looking at the narrative. If you had to help somebody, that might have triggered you temporarily to think about help and care a little more, right? Fairness and care. We started seeing a lot of our research looking at narratives in terms of appreciation. So if you don't know much about entertainment research, there was a sort of movement to go beyond enjoyment, beyond arousal and anhedonia, and start working in more pensive reactions, more reflective or eudaimonic reactions to media. And we found across several data points, we were seeing that when people would think about game narratives, they wouldn't necessarily think about enjoyment. They would talk about appreciation, meaningfulness, eudaimonia, deeper reflections. And in the game design research, there had been this shift to talking about above the neck verbs that happen, here, versus below the neck verbs, which are more action oriented. So you think, why would a game need the motion cap in the face? Well, if nonverbals are important. Well, why would nonverbals be important? Well, they might help communicate emotion, communicate closeness. Whereas down here, if I'm making a fighting game, I probably don't need to know much about the person's emotional state. This is just an object that I punch. So that was kind of interesting. And we saw this across several different data sets, qualitative data, survey data, experimental data. We were finding these associations over again. Controllers are a source of demand. So here is that there's emotional demands in games that go beyond just arousal and fun. Shouldn't surprise a lot of people. There were controllers that were important to the experience, right? And there had been a move, and still is, for naturally mapped controllers that take advantage of a human perceptual system, right? The one-to-one correspondence with the ways that we interact with the world. And I heard that this bowling ball might still be upstairs.
Yeah.
We did a study. We gave Chuck a receipt for, I think, $500 from the tool and die shop on campus, engineering school. He's like, well, we've never had to purchase any. What did you do? What did you do, right? We needed a naturally mapped bowling ball for our study, looking at the Nintendo Wii and self-termination theory and competence. And the controller is not a bowling ball. And you all know Ron likes to bowl. So after he critiqued my bowling stance for a while, went to Michael's and I carved out a styrofoam ball that a Wii controller could fit in, that you could put the controller in. And I'm not going to do it because you'll make fun of me, but you would go bowling with your hands. And so we go over to the tool and die shop and we hand them, we tell them what to do. We want to make a controller, but we can snap a Wii controller into a naturally mapped controller for this experiment that we're running. He said, okay, that's great. Where are your schematics? Thinking, piece of paper. And I handed him my styrofoam Michael's ball. And they entertained it. They made us a device and handed it back because it worked quite well, frankly, in the study. Now, we would have thought that this would have felt more natural, more intuitive with bowling. It actually turns out that a lot of folks report this one is more intuitive. Any reason why? So in their mind, it's not bowling, it's gaming. Not to mention, they do better with this one. I've probably done everything from play Jeopardy to slay monsters to surf the internet on this device. I mean, its strength is its flexibility. It's intuitive. I didn't learn the QWERTY alphabet. I learned my ABCs. But we've gotten so good at being able to think through this device that was supposed to slow us down. And we don't ask the question, can we type faster? The answer is Dvorak, but what's the point? We have 100+ years experience with this QWERTY keyboard, right? So we saw these findings over and over again that the industry was making these naturally mapped controls, and they weren't doing very well. That the traditional ones, the handheld ones, it's called the golden hands rule of game design, those were doing better. These are actually seen as paradoxically more demanding, more tripping. They're getting in the way of performance. And if you're trying to design an experience, I don't want to disrupt the performance. I want to enhance the performance. We think it's getting better, but we're still seeing the dominance of that pad at the end of the day. Whether it's through, path modeling, where we're seeing that naturally intuitive controllers were less natural, through qualitative surveys and studies and interviews, where people talk about precision, naturalness, comfort. My point is just that this other aspect of the experience also influences what the experience is requiring of you, which is going to play a role later. Of course, we already know that the social mechanics of these games matter. We've even done studies where we had people come into a lab, and we didn't do cyberball, we did the actual ball toss paradigm, where 3 people, 2 Confederates and a research participant, 2 Confederates play catch with each other and either ignore or include the research participant, to ostracize them. I throw things at people, I ostracize them, I make them put washers on string. And then afterwards, I let them choose what games they wanted to play. And we found that people who were socially included, if they played a game alone, they didn't like it as much. And it was almost the situation where they were expecting more sociality than they were getting out of it. So they were looking for something, didn't get that compared to their other experience. And that became kind of interesting as one data point. We saw that the actors in the games, the avatars, aren't just agents for parasocial relationships, where you form a fake relationship and they're not really there. People were forming authentic social relationships that went 2 ways. They would spend time with these characters. They would listen to the characters. They would give the characters what they want. And if you want a good example of this, if you have a pet, you know what I'm talking about, right? It may not be the same sociality as this interaction, but there's this give and take. I have to do things for you. You have a lot of agency over me. And we were seeing this in video games as well, where people are actually engaging with non-humans, which makes sense. If I can create a world with potentially social others, I can engage those people. So I've talked about these things in separate, but remember, so now you've got increasingly more social worlds with increasing different types of interaction types, with increasing different types of controllers, with more and more complicated stories, and you start to wonder where all of this is going to balance out. The individual studies are neat. What are they going to add up to in terms of user experience? Because we're slicing up games into really weird fundamental elements and controlling for the rest. But that's not how they exist. They exist in a package. So first, before we go any further, we have to be able to measure this stuff. I could yammer all day about my prior findings, but if we can't measure it, the perceptions of these different demand sources, then what are we doing? Like, where are we going to go with this information? So I took the feeling energy model in 2022. I still think that there might be at least 5 sources of demand. And I'm going to go through each one of them here individually. So there's the cognitive. It's the most obvious. I got to rationalize the system. I got to learn the logic. I got to solve the puzzle. It's the one we think about with most games. Otto's going to help us with this. We have a weird mascot. Let's just call it what it is. It's just the color.
Is it Gritty's baby?
It's just the color. Yeah, it's Gruffy's. Yeah.
It's supposed to be a free will question. Why is it?
They don't pay me enough. So we want to see how to rationalize. How do you measure that? Thinking very hard, mental gymnastics, drawing my mental resources, mental challenges that impact how to play the game stimulated my brain. The ones that are in gray, I'm going to explain that in a minute, they still work just fine, but we've translated this now in 5 languages, and these are the ones that didn't translate as well. When we went to like Korean, Mandarin, and Turkish, they just didn't translate as well in German. But again, these are perceptions. I'm taking a model, I should have said that sooner, that I'm not studying the technology. I'm studying the person's perception of their experience with the technology. That's a big fight in the tech field, in the user experience research. There's a lot of researchers at another large Big Ten university. They're like, technology is all about the interactivities in the technology. It's an objective feature of the device. And I don't deny that, but not everybody can push these buttons. And not everybody knows what they do. And if you're a watch gamers, you might be able to do really good things with the game. You give him the same controller, same game, same experience, and you can't do the same things. And so I'm very interested in the perception side more than the actual buttons on this device. And I feel pretty strongly about that, and there's reasons I could talk about all day. Then we get to the emotional, having this affective response to the experience. Okay, sure, we have some data on that, and if we went through all the items that came out in our initial analysis, the game tugged at my heartstrings, I was moved, strong emotional bonds, unexpected feelings. You're probably thinking to yourself, this kind of, the feels.
Gave me the feels.
5 languages now. People have the feels. I am as surprised as you are. We generated 20 items per dimension for our initial pool. These are the ones that came out, and the fields is one of them. And it is multicultural at this point. Multilinguistic, I can say cultural. Critique of this one, of course, it's awfully aligned with the more pensive, deeper emotional states, and it kind of skips over, maybe some more basic emotions. We can talk about that. What about the physical demands? I gotta touch this thing. Because these first two can happen in lots of media, but I gotta touch this one. I didn't expect it to break into controller and exertional. I thought it would just be physical demands. What we found in the data is that people would focus on the apparatus separately from what I have to actually do with my body. And that becomes relevant in newer interactive systems. If you've used VR, if you've played Beat Saber, if you've done these things. And I think the average VR gaming experience is about 14 minutes long. There's probably a reason for that. It's tiring. Whereas I could sit down and play Final Fantasy 11 for a couple of days, and it's much more sustainable. But the control, and most of the controller, natural mapping essentially, perceived intuitiveness. And then the exertion is feeling as if you expended yourself. So these are all coming out. And then of course there's the social actor, and we're careful not to say human, because they're not all human. But they're still social actors in the experiences. In fact, in later research, we're seeing evidence when we analyze our qualitative, our open-ended data, that players seem to want to make a distinction between humans and social actors. But when we look at the survey data, it always collapses back on itself. And so we can explain that. Socializing was important. I was aware of others. I was compelled to interact. I felt obligated, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Again, English, German, Mandarin, Taiwanese, Turkish, working on Korean now. We're working on translating it from VR now. That worked great. The problem with the first study was all VR games, so it seemed like a kind of cheating. You already have a gaming version, so a VR gaming version, shocker, fit. That's congratulations. So we're working on non-gaming VR application. I don't like the term of interactive storytelling. Psychophysiological substrates. What are the actual attentional components that underlie and predict these perceptions of demand? That's the project the lab is currently working on. And we're in the middle of spending my startup money to buy that equipment. That'll be fun. That's a good reason to get a job. Summarizing them there. We have done a lot of validation on this stuff. And I'm just going to summarize some of these because this is a little weird. This table is from the Turkish translation paper where we looked at how the demand measures correlated with other things that they should be correlated with. And then, of course, weren't correlated with things they shouldn't be correlated with. And the symbology here is telling you the extent to which they're replicating across the other previous validations. And I realize the danger of giving you 30 studies instead of 2 is I have to go very surface level. It's not a trick that make you think I'm not very good. I'll still answer questions. I'm just giving you the top level. So for example, NASA has the task load index that they use for astronauts. You don't want your astronauts overloaded in space. It's a stressful environment, I think. And the task load index, among other things, measures cognitive and exertional demands. Are you fatiguing the astronauts? Can they think through the interface well enough? And sure enough, cognitive demands were correlated with NASA TLX scores, and exertional demands were correlated with NASA TLX scores. And the other 3 weren't, and that's how it should be. They may have been in one study, but not across the multiple replications of this work. Emotional demands, emotional effort. Cognitive demands, cognitive effort. Exertional, physical effort. Social demands, social effort. Single item measures some POS. Again, just showing some discriminant and convergent validity. All right, emotional demands and appreciation. You would expect that. I really feel this deeper emotional involvement with the narrative. I should have a higher score on this eudaimonic dimension of media entertainment. Narrative ratings and emotional demand. The narratives are what often give the context for the emotional demand. It's the storyline. Controller demands and controller ratings. If the control is more demanding, I hate it. We expect this. Social demands and relatedness. I'm feeling closer to people. And I thought the game was very social. And so, again, I'm skimming the surface here for effect, but the point I'm making is the scale over and over and over again is correlating where it should. It's not 100% perfect, but it's working in the ways we think it should be working. And with that, by the way, those demands, I didn't even show you the EFA, CFA procedures, but even those were replicated 3 or 4 times. So we're very confident that those 5 dimensions are separate. And they're oblique, not orthogonal, but they are separate. And we're fairly confident they discriminate between people's discrete evaluations on those dimensions in ways that they should. Then I met some folks at CHI, Computers and Human Interaction, who don't read COM. And I love them because they're probably watching right now. But we had a great conversation about these 2 research groups in different fields literally stumbled across the same dimensions. They had the Corgus scale and I had the demand scale. And we did what I think a lot of scholars don't often do is we didn't have a Twitter flame war. We just email each other. Like, hey, I see you're working on perceptions of challenge in video games. I'm working on perceptions of demand in video games. I wonder if those are the same thing. That's how I met Jamie, by the way. It was on a paper on player-avatar interactions, but I wasn't looking to move on. I was just looking to do some more research. So I know that the Desasova team over in the UK, we did another study where we took all of our items, gave them out to gamers, asked gamers to recall these certain experiences, fill out the scales, and what we found is that all of the demand dimensions held. And they were pretty strong and they were pretty dominant. But there were these dimensions of Corgus, decision-making and performance, that were independent. What we think happened here is the teams may have been coming at this slightly differently to the extent of I was measuring what the game takes from me, requires from me. They were measuring how I responded to that. They were measuring what decisions that I make, how did I do in the game. It was more evaluative. And we're still working on this. It's actually under review right now. But it held up even in the face of other dimensions that could have potentially kind of scrapped some of this work. I was really proud of that. And the team and I, we still work together even today. We're still working on some of this work. Where are we taking this? Well, this is where I think I want to go eventually. I have not drawn the potential intercorrelations to keep it clean. I don't think demands are actually that important. You might be agreeing with me. But what I mean by that is, it's kind of like presence. That's not the goal of VR. That's a thing VR can do. But we care about it because it affects something else. I think that we can start identifying the formal features and characteristics of a game, of a VR experience, that can reliably be seen by audiences as cognitively or emotionally or exertionally or socially demanding, which will probably then predict the outcomes better than just looking at this to this, which is what we all learned here. This is intervening variables, right? This is just stimulus organism response. And a lot of our work in COM focuses on that organism. We take up the position that that organism, that human, is processing this information and making sense of it, and then reacting to it as a result. So when your chairs or deans want to ask you how video games are communication, that's one answer you can give, right? That's why I think this work's going to be really important. And I'll give a couple of areas where we're going with this, and then I'll stand with scrutiny afterwards. So we did some work on flow and cognitive demands. We were trying to figure out, how people who are having that balance of challenge and skill, how they would evaluate a game system. We used Richard Husky's Asteroid Impact, and we generally found that absolutely when people are in the flow state, they see the game as moderately cognitively demanding. You kind of expect that. It's not too hard. It's not too easy. The thing about the study that was particularly interesting, I should have made this slide actually much bigger, is that in an asteroid impact, there's 2 things you have to do. You have to navigate a spaceship around an asteroid field and collect little gems. That's the primary task. And while you're doing that, a little light flashes occasionally, and you have to hit the space bar to hit that light. Over here are the reaction times as the game got progressively harder. So in the boredom condition, the asteroids are super slow, and it's very easy to play. You can easily allocate attention to both spaces. And people's reaction times to that light, the idea being the quicker your reaction time, the more resource you have left over to respond to that light. In the boredom condition, people could do both just fine. You see they even got a little slower as they started kind of focusing on the game, but then they got back to attention. And in the flow condition, the game adjusts to your play. So you would expect it to be in the middle and not a lot of variation. And sure enough, it was like moderate response times, and they don't really change that much because the game is always adjusting to you. In the hard condition, where the asteroids are nearly impossible to avoid, super slow reaction times, because in the beginning, people are trying their best to not get hit by an asteroid. At some point, look how fast they got with the reaction time. They got good at light blinking. That was the only thing that was rewarding. Because it was either continue to be destroyed by asteroids or forget it, I'm doing this. It's kind of like when we're in class and we're not learning something. We're like, forget it, I'm doing this. It's cognitive offloading. How many video games require you to do more than one thing at a time? This might be really important to designers and developers, especially when folks get distracted. You might be able to see this cognitive offload, in action. And it might be tracing back to these perceptions of demand. We looked at streaming, where we had novices, people who don't stream, come in a lab, play a first-person shooter, and either they played the game, and in one condition, my students were in the back making up fake commentary as the audience watching the game. And the other conditions, they weren't doing that. We just used like a generic script for like computer code to control the stimulus on screen and all of that. Well, in this situation, it turns out that you would think they were aware they were being watched. The social facilitation notes I thought would happen here. They're being watched by an audience. They can recall that audience. They didn't feel any social demand. And the reason, I think, is quite simple. The game's too damn hard. You gotta focus on the game. So yeah, they could see the content. They can even recall like specific messages, but they were focused on the game. And so a big sales pitch for streaming is like this power of the audience to watch you. And I'm wondering if there's something missing in that equation. Obviously, you might expect a different result for professional streamers who love to perform in front of each other. But that was something we're coming across. And so we're seeing, again, this sort of when the demands might conflict, people make a choice. Where I'm going with all of this, I'll go back here for a minute. I don't think folks can have high levels of all of these if you want a positive experience. I think they start to try to shunt some off and do others. But you can do that in an interactive experience. Or maybe as designers, we have to let you be able to do that in an interactive experience. Looking at Beat Saber, we adjusted the field of view. So there's, the Saber game, and you got to look straight forward, and these blocks come at you. You have to cut them and move out of the way. You have to rotate 90 degrees and see the blocks, or you have to rotate 360. And as you increase that field of vision, people did see it as increasingly cognitively demanding and increasingly exertionally demanding. And the other three dimensions, I always measure them just as controls and to make sure the scale is not bumped. No differences. Pretty low, as you would expect. Well, the cognitive demands helped enjoyment. That's the fun part of the game. Small sample, right? But the exertional demands seem like they might potentially disrupt enjoyment. I want to have fun. I don't want to sweat the whole time. This could be it. And this is what we need to do more work with. You got cut off your code, unfortunately. But we're starting to see that. We didn't find differences in the relative demands between the two of these. And the reasons are real simple. It's not 360. It's actually 90, and then 90, and then 90. So nothing ever comes behind you. Does that make sense? Whereas real 360, I'm looking at Gary, there's a car behind me. I get the attention to that, right? I'm not sure we understand as we get towards the end, whether it's gaming or interactive narratives, how to tell stories in rectangles on the left versus stories in spheres, right? So we're seeing a huge move towards pro-social storytelling to get people involved in the lives of others through VR, what Milk calls the empathy machine. But we presume that the VR is needed for the experience. So like in this one here, great, you're letting me look around a school, which is kind of distracting, and I can look around my environment, but I don't know what I'm looking at. And I'm actually losing the message. And we're seeing data from our research team, from a couple of other research teams, to where the spherical storytelling is distracting. People don't pay attention to the message. They definitely feel present. And we are finding empirically This is gonna make a lot of people mad on the YouTube verse. Presence and narrative engagement are not the same thing. There's being in a space, and there's being in a story, and they're not one-to-one. We can show it to you with data. Tilo's got some data. Miguel Breda has some data. Over the last, I think Grace Ahn has some data on this. And I think it's a mistake we're making. We just assume if I give you a headset, you'll be in the story, donate more money. But we're not finding that. We're just finding you feel like you're in the environment. I had a student in West Virginia did a dissertation on drunk driving videos, and the same thing. You can be in the car when the drunk driving accident happens, but you're not any closer to the characters. You just feel like you're in the car. I think it might be something to do with demands. You're focusing so much on doing this that you don't have the resources left over for other things. And the storytelling mechanic isn't one-to-one. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you have to be more careful with it. It's not as simple as just putting a headset on. You may have to have some markers. You may have some other bogus talks about procedural rhetoric, where the interactivity is the thing you're trying to learn. They're one and together. Watching VR advertisements, we find out that when you watch them with just AI avatars, you're more likely to pay attention to the product. You're more likely to remember it. And we found this both in an experiment and with industry data across, I think, 80,000 users. If you drop little agents into the environment while you're watching an ad, the people will pay more attention. They won't skip the ad. So if you're HTC, you're trying to sell ad space in VR, it turns out you just create a couple of little avatars and put them in the room. And I'm wondering if there might be some social domain characteristics there. They actually feel like my buddies for a little while. Again, conflicts. What happens in an experience when I've got to climb a wall and save somebody? Can I pay attention to both at the same time? Are there conflicts here that I can't reconcile? Or do I have to choose one or the other? Or what many games do is they just give you one and not the other. And they switch back and forth. Great example here is a game called Detroit Become Human. Incredibly emotionally intense. And what they usually do, this is how you play the game. You talk them off the wall by pushing the X button, which is very different than getting on the VR gloves, getting on the bodysuit, getting on the treadmill and heading over there, right? I think this is an example of the developer's balancing demands. You can focus on the narrative and the characters and not pay so much attention to the physical aspects of the controllers. So. And then, more of the same in the last study I'm working on right now, taking it all the way back home. Let's go back to that dissertation. Let's go back to mood management, interactivity, and how much of my attention is caught up in the message. And we already know that this happens with the non-spectral disorder interaction, but what if we added the VR headset? That looks fun, but it's probably an additional source of demand. I gotta whip my head around and pay attention to all of this while driving the car, while shifting gears, while managing the clutch and the brake and the gas. And I'm gonna bet if I went back to that Bowman and Saber 2012 paper and added these layers, you would find that might be really good for folks who are bored. So there was even more attention pulled from their noxious mood state. But I bet for those stressed people, that's about the worst thing you could do, is promise them an immersive experience. And they may not know that, because it's not working out. So where does all this go? Well, first I need to thank Chuck. In fact, I saw this hat on campus. I don't know, it just looked like one that he would wear, like driving that convertible. So I wasn't giving up Sandy. I saw that and I was like, it's exactly the kind of lid I could see him wearing down the building. The day I got invited here, I found a book of his that I should probably give back to the gentleman in the lab. And I got a letter from annual giving from Dean probably got it. So I'll stick that in there. And I actually brought the book that we did, and I say it's not really mine, frankly, because Allison's in it, and Ron's in it, and Rafe is, and Dave is in it. A lot of people in this room are in this volume. And I would like to say I'm being charitable, but it's because they gave me a box of these. But I do want to get that back. I really owe this place a lot. And this work is still trying to find its way. I actually struggled to find a closing slide and a closing narrative, like a closing summary. It's very much open-ended. For me, I suppose it would be a combination of this. If nothing else stuck, I think it's trying to decompose our interactive experience somewhere along these lines. You'll note that I didn't include individual differences, but you can see how they could very easily slide their way into these paths. I have a measurement model that's not perfect, but it's pretty good at measuring these things. And we all know how to look at features and how to look at outcomes. And that's been my contribution that we're still working on. And I'd like to continue doing that. And the other one I'd leave you with is that I really want to stay in touch. Okay. So thank you for inviting me. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Is that hat orange?
It is incredibly orange. I don't know how to tell you how orange this hat or that campus is. Incredibly orange.
All right. It's a truck hat. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There was something about, because there's a blue one. Like, no, the orange one.
What outcomes are you, what focal outcomes are you most interested in?
That's a good question. So lately, the focal outcomes that I've been most interested in have actually been going more towards like empathy and pro-social change. The reason I bring that one up is I think it starts to bring up the clash of the emotional and social with the other ones. And I want to know if there is a sweet spot of sports that would actually, where are the parts of demand that would interact to increase pro-social change and empathy, and where are the ones that would clash?
That's good, because that brings me to the question I really want to know. And that is whether or not the technological characteristics at the front of the model, the formal features, and the focal outcomes, right, might interact in a way to change the way they're mediated by the organism. So, for example, different types of focal outcomes, if I'm looking at empathy as a focal outcome, but there are other types of focal outcomes that would be completely different from empathy, right, that perhaps would be related to formal features differentially. And so the relationship between the formal features and the outcomes are likely to be really different depending upon, the formal features are kind of fixed, right?
Right.
But the outcomes are varied. That you can look at all different types of focal outcomes. That's why I started to ask you that first. And with different focal outcomes, you would expect, well, the features are still kind of fixed, and we might expect them to be related to, to the focal outcomes kind of the same way, because even if the outcomes are different,
right,
but the way that the different types of demand would mediate the relationship between the features and the focal outcomes might have a lot to do with how certain features just are inherently related to different types of outcomes.
Yeah, sure. And it's a classic, when you draw a mediation model, you're sort of forcing this idea of complete mediation, which is not often what's going on here, right? So it's a fair point. A related one is that I'm not sure it's linear always.
So then let me go back. What type of formal features are you focusing on?
So, for example, when we're looking at controllers, that could be
Right.
an example of a formal feature, right? Or if we're looking at the presence of your avatar, that could be a feature we're talking about.
But I would challenge the fact that they're set, the formal features, because people, especially, that's one of the things that makes games fascinating, is that people can go in and change the formal features, either through the game mechanics or through social interactions, such as with...
I think of formal features a little bit differently, but in that sense, Dave, I agree with you. Yeah.
I think we're thinking about them fairly similar.
I was talking about the technological features.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we are thinking about them
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah. Things like challenge, the challenge structure, the balance system in the game, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And part of this is we've been trying to think of, like, the project that I haven't gotten a hold of yet, but I've been in conversation with the developer on, is this idea of, are there consistent signatures? Are there like some set of features that reliably are seen as more or less demanding? Because if that isn't the case, there's some reconfiguring that has to go on here. Maybe it's too personological, which means that whether it's the outcome interacting with the demand signature or some individual differences might be more powerful than the actual, features themselves. You think about like mental models, for example. The QWERTY discussion earlier is predicated on all of us having a mental model for a QWERTY keyword. If we don't, then that's not going to work the same way, right? So it's a fair question. It's one that, and again, I know it sounds like sort of the excuse of the day, but we got kind of shut down for a while. So a lot of those features got locked up, but I am hoping to see that we have some reliable correspondence. One good example, though, field of vision. We found that you increase the field of vision of a VR game, you reliably increase its cognitive demand, and you reliably increase its exertional demand. That'd be one example. Gary, then over here.
You said we should keep apart the spatial presence, the experience of spatial presence, and let's say narrative involvement. So I think that's a good starting point, but I also can imagine that they have certain sweet spots where they overlap and come together. So maybe just an example, and then I want to ask you where you think this happens. Some 25 years ago, we did a study on a movie called Saber. It was a 3D movie with this, this green and red goggles. You could watch the 3D, and it existed in 2D and 3D. And you had physio data, and no difference, except for one situation where Heidi looked down into the valley from the cliff. So there are just functionalities where spatial presence is part of the narrative. And if you read a book, these are the pages where the author will just give you every detail of how deep and how kind of threatening it is. So I would say yes, and maybe this is the important thing to think about. Where is it functional for the network?
That first note, I think that's a better. You've actually helped crystallize something that I've been trying to formulate. Is does the space play a role in the experience? So the research on awe talks about this. Like you wouldn't expect awe if the Grand Canyon wasn't central to the experience, because you would hope the person's resources are allocated towards the experience. We see it in games as well, where if I'm not the driver, if I can be the passenger for a moment, I can devote space to this. But if the stuff that's supposed to increase all is way in the background, it's not going to matter. So I love the point that it's not that they can't go together; it's that they don't inherently go together. But there probably is something in the narrative where the space is the story. It's part of the reinforcement. That's a really good point. Yeah, I like that a lot. Actually, that helps explain my frustration. Well, to that video earlier, it's probably the case that the high school lobby wasn't important to that narrative. So when these folks spent all this money 3D filming a high school and couldn't figure out why people didn't want to donate any more money to the high school between flat and 3D, it's because the lobby wasn't relevant.
Look at the Avatar movie.
Yeah.
Just watch it again. It's just wasted 3D in many moments.
For its own sake.
But when they start flying, it's not wasted anymore.
And that's easily testable, right? Like to your point of your study, and in gaming especially, it wouldn't be hard to find those moments. And cut them in, cut them out. That wouldn't be hard to do at all. It's a good point. Thank you for that. Absolutely. That answers maybe the question about increasing empathy. Yeah.
So I'm also curious if there's like a way to separate some things out, because you had said that with virtual reality, something that we're finding is for some people, the immersion can like stress them out. It puts on too much demand, or maybe an additional demand to some of these demands. And I'm thinking right now of the driving simulator that you showed that has all the, like, there's a visually and like probably auditorily immersive experience in that. They're also controlling the wheel and the gas pedal and the brake and the clutch. What if that visual and auditory immersion was there, but they were given a controller that they're used to playing a driving game with?
And that's actually, if we can finally get the study off the ground, that's the hope, is that we can separate out wearing a headset and not wearing a headset versus using a standard handheld Golden Hands controller versus an apparatus like that. I guess I did model it over here. That would be the hope in the study, is that we would cross those two things. The functional problem with it is that the original study design was already a 4x2. And but I mean, that's not an excuse, right? I mean, we have to do the research, and that's what I was hoping to find out. That's kind of why I think that study would be interesting, because I think that the VR, I didn't actually map it there very well at all. I had to find a way to map that with the extra controllers. My suspicion, and this kind of gets to Ron's note, not everybody's going to do that. Some folks are going to look straight forward. This is why study 2 isn't published, if you remember. Because I had thought that more of this would mean more demand. No, if you're doing good, you're going to be very smooth. You're going to be very smooth and very controlled. So this was a bit of a hitch in the logic, right? It could be the case that a lack, and of course, this is reinforcing another lesson. Don't forget the data you didn't even realize you were collecting, right? Because in this case, if somebody is focused forward, that might be an indicator of a different type of engagement than the person that's doing this. Whether it's, think about cognitive offloading. If I'm not very good at driving this car, I might just start looking around because that's more interesting than me not driving very well. But to your point, the study would need to have all three of those things. So I have to think a little more deeply about just the main effects of the VR separate from the control system and how they would matter. Because the control system, the neurons that with Allison, that one is pretty fixed. But the VR one isn't. The only thing fixed in the VR is that you have a stereoscopic vision. You still have to use it however you're going to use it. And so there's a degree of freedom in the player that is proving to be a little bit elusive. But it's a good point. Yeah.
I was told this has to be quick as we were wrapping it up, but I don't think this is a quick question, so maybe you could just.
I can do this.
So you've talked about a lot of different sort of types of demand, and I just wonder if you could maybe noodle for a hot second on like what is being demanded, like what is the resource, right? Because you've talked about social, emotional, exertional, and then you've talked about these so those are all internal to the user, right? And you've talked about external demands, like controller demands, challenges in the game, story time challenges. You know what I mean? So you have like two sources there, and I'm trying to reconcile that with a single unitary resource.
Same here. So this is part of where the physiological application and extension is going to be really important. I can give a quick answer. I can give a longer one later. I would like to think, for coming at it from more of an attentional processing model, that it's all related to attention in some way. And that the thing you're perceiving is what element of that feature pulled my attention broadly construed. And then the way I give that attention requires different mechanisms. It's all about cognitive attention, which is limited in bandwidth, which might manifest in different ways. That's how I've been working to codify this. I'm a little behind the curve in some of the deeper cuts there. That's where I think it's going. It's not so much that they're like actual types of demand. We're how do I say this? Different types of attention. We either give attention or we don't, right? But it's how we go about actually doing that. That's the best answer I have right now. I'm still playing with this a little bit because in some way I have to allocate something and then make it happen. And sometimes that's going to be, this, and sometimes that's going to be some other type of reaction. And I think what people are responding to is their perceptions of what caused that, right? And they're probably giving essentially a lay explanation of what's going on in here, if that makes any sense. We're in the middle of grading it all out, and we just haven't gotten that far yet.
This, for all of you here, that was a quick explanation. But I've been asked to wrap things up because we're a little bit late, but let me just tell a Chuck story on the way and get this out.
Yeah.
I don't know about putting it on.
Right.
I have a huge head, so I'm not sure it'll fit me. But Chuck would always say that he would take all the resources that we had that he possibly could for graduate students. And he would give them the money to travel. They got more travel money than we did as faculty members. Don't know if you faculty members knew that, but it's true. And I asked him one time, what's that all about? And he said, these graduate students are the future of our department. They're the reputation of our department. They're going to take us forward and go out and show people everything that we're all about. And he always called it the MFG Mafia. And I think we can see today that he was right. These have been 3 fantastic presentations, and it's really heartwarming to see where everybody's taken the common knowledge that they gained here. So let's give everybody a big applause.
Sure.
Yeah.
Amy?
No, I like that actually.
couple minutes in.
What?
It's like, I need a drink. Oh.
2 minutes in.
It doesn't taste as good. Not yet. Yeah.
Hold up. Becky did ask it.
But I didn't see the Twitter until like literally 3:15. So thank you, Becky.